All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We are joined once again by Dr. Stephen Napier, friend of mine out of Villanova. He's been on the show several times, at least maybe 4 or 5 times now over the years. It's always a joy to be chatting with you, Stephen. We're already having a good conversation backstage, as it always goes. I was chat with that. I'm like, oh, we should have recorded that, and then we missed all the good. You missed listeners. You missed all the good stuff. It's gone forever. Problem of evil. That's just, it is what it is. And we're going to try and deal with it today. And we're going to deal with a specific, well, I know this is a debate, right? Is like, is the problem of divine hiddenness, a species of the problem of evil, or is it really a different issue? But either way, we're going to talk about the problem of divine hiddenness. You have a new article, a very provocative and very good article that was just published in Religious Studies. Is there non-resistant non-belief? This is a central component of the problem of divine hiddenness, and it's one that you don't see challenged very often. So it's going to, I'm looking forward to having this conversation. So thanks for being here again, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pat. It's great. Yeah.
So let's, before we dive specifically into your article, and I know you have some new thoughts as well since this article was published, I want to talk about, let's make no assumptions. Let's think that this is people's, first time hearing about this particular argument or issue in philosophy of religion. So how do you like to begin to introduce the problem of divine hiddenness? What are we dealing with here? And then even before we get to your specific response in this paper, I would like to just hear some of your more general ideas on how you've thought about responses to the problem of divine hiddenness over the years as well, if that sounds good to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a great place to start. So I think the best way to explain the argument from divine hiddenness is to actually begin by disambiguating it from the problem of evil, right? Because that kind of shines a light on precisely what the problem is. So we can imagine, Peter Van Inwaarden has us imagine a world where there's no evil, absolutely no evil. No one does any evil. There's no moral evil. There's no earthquakes. There's no tornadoes. No diseases, no viruses, no cancer. Yep. But God doesn't do anything. There's no miracles either. There's no divine revelation. There's no, there are no religious experiences of any sort. There's just nothing there. And in that world, we can imagine there being no problem of evil, right? Because there simply isn't anything evil, but there would be a problem of hiddenness, right? Mm-hmm. God would not be apparent. God would not be doing anything that manifests a desire to unite or have a relationship with his creatures. Right, so at least starting there, we can kind of zero in on or put the microscope on what the problem is that there's maybe not enough religious experience, or there's in general just not enough evidence in the actual world for God's existence. And we can, equally imagine a world where, just the converse is true, where there's evil, but for every single instance of evil, God directly communicates by divine direct revelation the reason for it to each of the sufferers. And in that world, right, you might see that, well, there's no problem with divine hiddenness, but there's still a problem of evil.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So even though there's a reason given, there's for the evil, you might think that, still, why do we need the evil? But there wouldn't be a problem of hiddenness, right? So that's kind of what proponents of the divine hiddenness argument are looking for. They're looking for evidence. In Cartesian terms, you might use the term clear and convincing evidence, or clear and distinct ideas. So that's what we're looking for. And the idea is that a good and loving God would make his existence manifest. Why? Well, because a good and loving God would desire relationship with his creatures, and in order to have that relationship, by the way, a mutual relationship, I do think J.L. Schellenberg, who is a chief proponent of this argument, is right on this, right? God, being good and loving, would desire mutual, right, relationship with his creatures And that requires, at the very least, that the creature know that God exists, right?
Mhm.
If to be a mutual relationship. And furthermore, I think Schellenberg is also right on this. He's picking up on the Thomistic idea that, well, if our highest good is union with God, then God should be very generous in sharing his being with us.
Sure.
Now, for Schellenberg, he wants to understand that last requirement, which I think is the right requirement, as concretely being realized in the form of conscious awareness of God. I don't know about that. I mean, because being, this is one of the points that I bring up in my article, is that being consciously aware of God would, because our consciousness is very finite, right? Our consciousness can be of specific things in the universe, but God is not a specific thing in the universe. God is the very foundation of all being. And if we had a conscious, or if I had some sort of conscious awareness of God, I would doubt that I actually did.
Mm-hmm.
God is infinite, and my conscious awareness is finite.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, we can kind of, at the very least, we can expect some distribution of religious experiences. We should expect some distribution of miracles. We should expect, when somebody, and Schellenberg does bring this example up, when someone is thinking through an argument for God's existence, one would have the sense that this is just a good argument, right? It's just a valid and sound argument. It's beautiful, right? Some people have even made such assessments of, say, the ontological argument, and some don't. But but there's a certain elegance to some of the traditional arguments for God's existence,
right?
And God can use that to kind of bring about a quasi-religious experience in someone who's considering this purely intellectual or syllogistic argument.
Yeah.
All right, so that's all premise one. A good and loving God would desire this, would desire this union, and this union would have to be mutual. Why? Because relationship with God would be the most, would redound to our benefit, or it would be a highest benefit. So God should kind of prioritize that kind of disclosure. And the second premise of the hiddenness argument is, well, we don't have that. We don't have enough evidence. We don't have the distribution of religious experience that one would expect. We don't have the miracles. Well, from there, it follows that it follows that a good and loving God doesn't, or there's evidence that a good and loving God doesn't exist. Now, for some of your listeners, they might think, well, I have experienced a miracle, or I have experienced a quasi-religious experience. Why is that not enough? And I think Schellenberg will answer that question with, well, if God desires union with his creatures, he desires union with all of his creatures, right? There should be a distribution of religious experience, that is conscious awareness of God, to any seeker, any honest seeker, right? So that's why he refers to this as non-resistant non-belief. So Schellenberg will grant that there are those who resist belief in God. But what Schellenberg's claim is that, well, there are plenty of non-resistant seekers,
right,
who just come up short. They come up empty. They don't. They don't have enough evidence according to their own assessments. One particularly interesting example here is, say, ancient peoples, right? Prehistoric human beings, right? There is non-resistant non-belief. If God exists and God exists while they existed, we should have expected them to believe in God, but we don't see that. Now, I don't think that is an empirically potent example. I mean, Schellenberg puts a lot of weight on it, but by definition, prehistory, we don't have a lot of data on what they believed or experienced. So just set that aside. I think he does have his more plausible claim is that you do have contemporary atheists and atheists throughout the centuries who did give theism an honest go at it, and have considered belief in God and arguments against belief in God faithfully and fairly, and came up empty.
Mm-hmm.
Even if there's one of those, that would be a problem on theism.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
God loves that person just as much as you and me and everyone else, right? So that's enough to kind of empirically defend premise 2, right, which is the idea that there is non-resistant non-belief. And that's something that Schellenberg would say is incompatible with what a good and loving God would allow.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's a fairly strong argument, right? To the extent that the evidential premise, right, the premise 2 is supported. Now, just one more initial. This is an initial observation. This is all setting up.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, I want to take a few initial shots here too, but I want you to finish. Yeah.
This is, sorry for the long.
No, this is great. This is great.
Most commentators, at least those who want to argue against the argument from divine hiddenness, will take issue with premise 1, the idea that a good and loving God would be so self-disclosive of his being in the way that Schellenberg envisions that God should be. And you'll see something similar to what occurs in responses to the argument from evil, and you'll see theodicies or explanations or justifications for why God would remain a little bit hidden, or why God would not want to disclose himself in this way, or in what Schellenberg thinks should be conscious awareness. Okay. Very few people have taken issue with premise 2, right? Mm-hmm. Why? Because, well, it's kind of disrespectful to, right? You're basically saying to the proponent of the divine hiddenness argument, well, you haven't really taken an honest look at the arguments,
right?
Mm-hmm. And so that was the tactic that I've taken in my most recent article. Douglas Henry has also done the same thing, and someone else, I forget his name or her name, no one's, hopefully the person's not insulted, but there's someone else out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's enough for the intro right now.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'd like, before we get into your full response to this again, I'd like to just maybe kind of circle around other things that, and it's been a minute since I've thought about this one. You've kind of returned me to this debate, but you brought up von Inwagen. I think he's actually pretty helpful on this. Mm-hmm. And I also think that one's conception of God and human nature obviously bears in on this very significantly. I mean, both me and you are Catholics, and this is not exclusive to Catholics, but we have a particular view of salvation, where salvation has little to do with assenting to like some collection of abstract propositions and assigning credences to them, right?
Yeah.
Whatever else God wants is our moral perfection in such a way that we can be freely, lovingly united to him. And if I think of Stump's work and everyone else about Catholic justification and sanctification, it really requires a sort of internal, a healing from an internal fragmentation and alienation, right? For that mutual indwelling to be possible between man and God. So it demands a sort of moral and spiritual regeneration and reintegration of our entire psyche. So it's a really sort of complex matter, right? And where von Inwagen comes in is he says, well, look, belief in God is in some sense, or at some point, it is a necessary but not sufficient component to a life of true faith and true salvation. And he gives the example, if I remember, of people believing that God exists for different reasons, and showing that these could be ranked in terms of their value, right? That I could believe in God for reason A. I could also not believe in God, and I could believe in God for reason B, and they could be ranked in terms of their value, just like that, right? Where the last, where I believe in God for some reason that might be epistemically fine, right, but might be for frustrating or a hindrance to my actual moral perfection or progress, could be worse than me being in a state of agnosticism or atheism, right?
Yeah.
And the reason I think finding one is really helpful is as long as you just show that that's a possibility. You don't have a theodicy at that point, but you at least have a pretty, I think, strong defense.
Yeah.
Right. And I would weave that with, again, the deeper understanding of what salvation and union with God really means, which is, again, not this. It's a complicated affair, and I'm thinking of the ways that I think Aquinas thinks about it, and contemporaries like Eleanor Stump, and so I just throwing all that out there, and you can take a whack at it however you want. Yeah.
Yeah. So all those, as you pointed out, those are defenses, and the idea is to give some sort of network of beliefs that would function as an explanation for why God wouldn't be so manifest or clear. And also, I think, with Stump's work in particular, it's right to point out that knowledge of God is parasitic on the condition of one's soul, right? But you have to be careful with that. It's not just suggest that atheists are immoral. That's not the suggestion. The suggestion is that there are certain practices, epistemic practices, that are associated with acquiring belief in God or having a sense of God. And those practices kind of coalesce around participation in the sacraments. They include prayer. They include different types of prayer. So if someone is not engaging in any of those practices, well, of course, they're not going to acquire this sense of the divine. And that's even supposing, all of what Plantinga has to say, right? That we have this, that God does exist. There's this sensus divinitatis, right? There's this faculty, cognitive faculty, that we can expect as part of our cognitive furniture. And if this faculty is functioning correctly, it will deliver outputs, beliefs that God exists, and maybe some others. I would only take it one step further as a Catholic, that activating this faculty, or actually feeding this faculty with the right inputs, requires a participation in a religious way of life or a liturgical way of life. So again, I mean, if one is not doing that, one is not going to have access. Now, I will say, what could Schellenberg say at this point? Well, Schellenberg could say that, well, why is that a requirement, right? I mean, so long as my will desires friendship with God, why do I have to go to church? Shouldn't God respond to that disposition of will? Isn't that enough? That's, I mean, Schellenberg's a smart guy. I think that's a plausible response. Why is the will not enough? And I think, to kind of wrap that up, I think Stump is right that, well, the will has suffered this injury. It's not enough to simply desire it. It needs to be repaired. It needs to be treated. So, though it wants treatment, it's like the patient. The patient might be sick and desires treatment, is in the hospital, but is not treated yet, right? The patient is not ready for being discharged prior to the treatment. And Stump would say, continuing with this analogy, is the will is like that. The will needs to be treated before it can be sensitive to divine input. well, so those are my thoughts on that aspect of the discussion. But,
yeah, good. I remember reading, I should have refreshed a little bit more too in some of your original work, and maybe this will tie into your paper of, again, and this is a contemplation on human nature, which again, I think cannot be overlooked, right? And what the true integration around the true good actually looks like. It's a very complicated affair, right?
yeah.
And the value of God sort of healing us or bringing us to our end state in a way that accords with our nature, which is social animals, animals that live in community with tradition, right? Exceptions can be made, but it is a principle of classical theism that in the general run, God is going to work with us in accord with our nature,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, he could deliver that. And presumably, as theists, we argue he does at least occasionally, deliver those exception cases, those miracles. But in the general run, that isn't how God is going to, grace builds upon nature is the other thing that I think definitely factors into this debate and the problem of evil debate as well. So I don't know if you had any other thoughts with that, or if you just want to keep moving with your actual response at this point. But I think it's good for people to see the wider scope of this debate before we just focus in on your paper as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, it's a very good observation there. There's a lot going on. I mean, if you were to do like a JSTOR search or not PubMed,
Mm-hmm.
some of these searches, just do hiddenness, philosophy, you're going to get a lot. there's a lot going on here. Yeah, that's all I have.
Good. All right. Let's get into your paper now. So now we're getting into the main thrust of things. Again, the paper is, I love when articles just have the title just is perfect, right? It just is what it is. Is there non-resistant non-belief? So begin walking us through this. It's a very provocative. I think it's an excellent paper. I think it
Thanks.
really is great. And I remember telling you years ago, you told me the seed form of this, and I thought it was brilliant back then. And I was really excited because I didn't know that this was something you're still working on. I just saw it pop up. I got to get Steven back on the podcast. This is awesome. So let's dive into it now. Yep.
So thanks for that. It's a great promo. So I guess my basic shtick with the argument from divine hiddenness goes something like this. So get back to premise 2. And now let's get into specific iterations of how premise 2 could be defended. Remember, premise 2 is the claim that there is non-resistant non-belief. And the defense for that claim will be something to the effect that there's not enough justification. Particularly, there's not enough distribution of conscious awareness of God,
Mm-hmm.
which I interpreted to just mean religious experience.
Sure.
The article that I wrote and published a while ago really stemmed from reading Schellenberg's treatment of religious experience, and in his book Wisdom to Doubt. And there was an interesting tactic. What he did is he argued two things. One is that, well, these religious experiences, you get contradictory beliefs out of them, right? And his second is one that I spent much more time focusing on is he claimed that there can be a naturalistic explanation for all of them.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, you just asked the question, if you were a non-resistant seeker, would you presume that a naturalistic explanation is the right one to give for all the iterations of religious experiences
Mm-hmm.
that have occurred? And it struck me that the answer has to be no. Right? What was interesting is Schellenberg is clear. He says that, well, one could give a naturalistic explanation along the lines of some sort of neuro hallucination or
seizures.
Seizures in the temporal lobe are associated with religious experiences. So I had the thought, which I think is quite plausible, is that, well, that presumes that naturalism is true, right? It looks like what the what the evidence for God's existence has to do is kind of dethrone naturalism.
Mm.
The only type of experience or event that's going to be powerful enough to convince Schellenberg is something that resists all naturalistic explanations. And you might think, well, why require that? Why presume that? And I argued that, well, the only way you could presume that is if you presume naturalism. And once you presume naturalism, you can no longer argue that you're a non-resistant seeker.
Right.
There's this presumption in favor of naturalism. Now, well, yeah, I'll stop there. So that was the basic idea. I don't know if you have follow-up questions, or there was more going on.
Yeah, no, obviously, the paper is extremely detailed and well written, but that's the section that I wanted to focus in on was really just experience and circularity.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just read a paragraph from it, I think this would be helpful to people, and we can talk about some of these presumed naturalistic explanations as well. Because it's just like I remember there was years ago when I was first investigating theism. This is kind of relevant, Stephen. And I really think I was not. I genuinely as non-resistant as I can. But the other problem with this is like, how transparent are we to ourselves? Even right? How often I've looked back at my past and like, oh no, even outside of the theistic context, like I was engaged in massive self-deception.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There just wasn't a real transparency even to myself. Like, how well do we even know our own psychology is another huge question mark on all of this. But I remember talking to some guy, and he was an atheist, and I was bringing up a lot of these miracle claims, and he would just keep sending me this paper about seizures. And I just kept thinking it was so implausible, right? I'm like, this is okay, great. There's this, whatever PubMed paper on seizures, but I'm like, no, I'm reading these accounts, and they're like ridiculous, right? Ridiculous accounts, and like, even if there is this sort of seizure-like brain activity going on, my natural thought is, as a sort of open investigator, is these things aren't competitive, which is what you said in your paper. So like, I wasn't presuming naturalism, right? That it's seizure, end of story. I was, at least because the other accounts seemed just so ridiculous that unlike normal seizure-like activity that people explain, that it's okay, something mediated through, which is exactly what you say in your paper, a particular brain state that is seizure-like. But why would that defeat the experience? So it was interesting reading that in your paper, because like in my own sort of, I guess, progress on, investigating theistic belief, that was specifically something that was, I remember encountering with somebody and just thinking, like, man, it's just, when you get into, it's all about the details though, isn't it? Right? It's all about, like, on the surface, it sounds very plausible, but like when you really read these accounts, or you talk to people that have had these experiences, it's all about the details. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to throw that out there, but you pick it up wherever you want. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned that they're not competitive, right? And I think that's the key, is that one could say, well, all of our thoughts or ideas or beliefs have a neurological correlate. At least if you're assuming naturalism, you have to assume that. So that's not too surprising. So God, knowing our nature, would know that, well, a seizure in this part of the brain will bequeath or deliver an experience of me. Right? Why think that seizure is not caused by God, just because it's a seizure in the temporal lobe, I think is what the specifics are. I don't see why God can't cause these things to occur to bring about an experience, a religious type experience. I mean, when we think of, Plantinga's good on this. I mean, when we think of 2 + 2 = 4, certain neurons in our brain are firing. When we think through an argument, certain clusters of neurons are firing. the fact that certain things fire and we have certain ideas or experiences shouldn't be incompatible with the idea that God is causing them to fire. God would work through our nature, not in spite of it. So yeah, that's. So I mean, the idea is I'm with you on this one. Even if it were the case that all religious experiences were you were to discover that in the moment that they happened, I don't know how you would find this out, but even if you did, that all of these experiences are associated with certain seizure-like activity in the temporal lobe, that still wouldn't be incompatible with the idea that God is causing them to occur, right? So you still don't have an argument that that it's a purely naturalistic explanation.
Right. So that's great, and I'm really glad we brought that up. And I know there's a few others we want to run through, but just to reiterate I think the crux of what you're bringing up, and this is from your paper, you said the problem highlighted in this subsection is even more severe than what you talked about before. His argument, Schellenberg's, against the epistemic worth of religious experience must assume a naturalistic explanation, but assuming a naturalistic explanation is incongruent with non-resistance. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that seems totally right. Right. So now we're just going through examples of highlighting why this is the case. So, all right. Yeah. Where do we go from here on this?
All right. So, well, we could go one of two ways. Well, to kind of finish the thought. So what's interesting in Schellenberg is, well, so his argument is, look, these religious experiences fall prey to a naturalistic explanation. Okay, even if that's true, right? Even if they don't have or they don't confer the epistemic benefits that Schellenberg thinks that they should confer, then one wonders why why conscious awareness of God should bear this huge epistemic importance. Right. So if conscious awareness of God, I mean, that seems to be just another phrase to describe some sort of specific type of religious experience. But if religious experience doesn't deliver the epistemic goods, why would a conscious awareness of God purport to deliver the epistemic goods that Schellenberg wants?
Right.
So it looks like to use
that God wouldn't want to give you goods that aren't actually goods, is what we're saying.
Yeah. I mean, Schellenberg is arguing that they're not epistemically good enough, and well, that kind of plays into God's. God wouldn't disclose. So why would you expect that a good and loving God would disclose conscious awareness of God if you've argued that conscious awareness of God is effectively
epistemically worthless?
It is effectively epistemically worthless.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. I just want to make sure people get that. That's good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, again, because if these religious experiences or conscious awareness of God is so epistemically fragile, in this, by which I mean that they succumb so easily to a naturalistic explanation, where anybody who doubts just the least bit would not have a justified belief in God. Why would God be so concerned about delivering that or bequeathing that, right? If God knows that that's not going to bring about the mutual union that God is after.
Right.
So, so it seems like Schellenberg is stuck saying two different things with regard to the epistemic worth of religious experiences, and that's saying incoherent things is probably is a marker of a bad argument.
Yes. Good. Okay. Great. All right. So that all seems right to me, and I don't know if there's a need to expand upon that point. I don't know, unless there's an objection that you've seen or thought about to that particular line that you want to address now, or if you want to just keep moving forward with.
Yeah, I haven't gone back and checked to see if there's response. I don't know. You may have looked at it more recently. I don't know if there were any citations, but I can't imagine what could be said, right? So the way the argument goes, at least the last point, either religious experience delivers the epistemic goods or it doesn't. If it does, then we would expect that it wouldn't be so epistemically fragile. It would not be so easily discounted or set aside with these silly, as you pointed out, these naturalistic explanations, hallucination, temporal lobe seizures, etc. And if it does supposed to deliver the epistemic goods, then why attack them? Why denigrate them? Now, it might be that Schellenberg could reply and say, well, I haven't had these experiences. But then I have a remark to that as well in the article, that Schellenberg also elsewhere rightly distances himself from like an epistemic chauvinism, he doesn't correctly want to be epistemically self-centered. Right? He doesn't want to move from I haven't had the requisite experience to no one else has. That would be really bad.
Yeah, he's not using himself as the model of non-resistance, right?
Yeah, and rightly so. I think he's careful in that regard. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I can't imagine what can be said.
Okay, great. All right. So, all right, where are we going next? Because I know you said you had some new ideas too. But I want to make sure that we covered everything else that you want to in this paper. By the way, people should know that there's a lot more in this paper, and it is open access, or at least it was when I first saw it. So I will be sure to link it so people can read the whole thing.
Yeah, it was open access. Thanks to Villanova for helping with that. So here are some new ideas, and maybe they, your listeners will recognize the similarities here, but maybe I'm changing up the language a little bit. But so Plantinga, Ellen Plantinga, in his book Warranted Christian Belief, he starts off and he makes a distinction between de jure objections and de facto objections. By de jure, he means about the justification of religious belief. And by de facto, he means about the truth or factual aspects of the belief.
Yep.
And the premise of the book is basically that in the history of Christianity and theistic belief, there have been a lot of criticisms to the effect that not just that theism or belief in God is false, but that religious belief is irrational. Right? It's unjustified. There's something wrong with the religious believer. Mm-hmm. And that's a de jure claim. And he his project is to say, well, to ask the question, well, what is this true? Right? What would count as a de jure objection to religious belief, in particular Christian religious belief? Well, that question requires asking, well, what would count as justification? He calls it the meta question. Right? So before we can answer the question, does religious belief satisfy justification? Does it give you enough evidence in terms of the arguments for God's existence or religious experience or whatever it might be? We have to know, well, what counts as a justified belief to begin with? What counts as evidence? Well, part of the answer to that question makes two broad categories. So we could either focus on what counts as a justified belief, or we can focus on what counts as a justified believer, focusing on the agent, right? And whether that agent has reliable faculties, right? Well, Plantinga starts with justified belief, right? And now he doesn't say this, but just to kind of a first stab at what would count as a justified belief, religious belief in particular, might be to say that, well, what counts as enough evidence is there is an event or argument that resists all naturalistic explanations. So similar to, the hiddenness discussion, right? Or at least the defenses of premise 2 of the hiddenness argument. And one might think that, well, if an event like, say, the resurrection, resists all naturalistic explanations, that would be a good piece of evidence, or a miracle, or something like that. Would be a satisfactory piece of evidence that God exists, or some sort of supernatural entity exists.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are a couple things that can be said, at least in response to that principle. And the first thing that might be said is, well, why would good evidence for theism have to rule out all naturalistic explanations? Right? It looks like, stemming from the key point of my article, is that looks like naturalism has to be presumed or privileged. Right? One must presume the truth of naturalism, and then the theist has to dethrone it.
Yeah.
Really, do away with all naturalistic explanations.
Right.
Again, another way of putting it is that one might think that following out that principle will deliver true beliefs because naturalism is true.
Mm.
It seems like the only reason why you would hold on to that principle and think that that principle, by following it out, is going to give you true beliefs is because you think that naturalism.
Because you already think that it's true. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. So you can see the problem there is that the de jure objection that religious belief doesn't satisfy justification, and justification is defined with reference to ruling out naturalistic explanations,
Mm-hmm.
already assumes an answer to the de facto question.
Yes. Right.
So you don't have a de jure objection until you settle the de facto issue. Right? You have to assume that God doesn't exist, or that theism is likely false.
Mm-hmm.
In your definition of what counts as justification, right, which should be a neutral definition. Right? And the second problem with that principle is how it typically functions or operates. There are a lot of people out there who might think this. And what happens when a skeptic encounters an event or a miracle or something that resists all natural explanations? Well, it didn't happen. That's the response, right? And so in essence, or in practice, the principle it rules out the possibility of acquiring religious belief at all.
Mm.
Okay, now if you were to provide a little bit more neutral definition, this gets into Plantinga's actual discourse. He goes through and he considers John Locke and Descartes, and here, I can be a little bit quicker. You might think that, well, a justified belief is one that is self-evident, evident to the senses, so some sort of immediate access requirement, right? And if you base your beliefs on those beliefs that are immediately accessible or self-evident or evident to the senses, then yeah, you likely have a solid network of beliefs. And Plantinga says, well, the problem with that principle is that it's self-referentially incoherent, right? It doesn't satisfy its own criteria, right? It's not evident to the senses.
And you can't get to it through deductive chain, right? Yeah.
You can't get to a deductive chain of reasoning.
Yeah.
It's not self-evident that a belief is justified only if it's self-evident, evident to the senses, or based on what is self-evident or evident to the senses. And we can easily imagine counterexamples to this, right? So take beliefs based on, say, stereotypes or biases. To the one who's biased or stereotypical or racist or sexist, those racist and sexist beliefs seem evident, right? Especially to the one who's, steeped in such stereotypes or biases.
Yeah.
But they certainly don't count as justified. It's just one example.
Yep.
We could expand examples, but that one example suggests, well, in order to give an account of justification, we have to focus on the faculties, right? So a person who's biased, the reason why it's not justified is because the person's faculties for generating beliefs about other people or their social perceptions was not functioning correctly, right? Or their inquiry was off.
Mm-hmm.
So Plantinga then focus on, well, what kind of features of the believer are we looking for? And he settles on, well, we have to consider whether the believer's faculties are reliable or functioning properly. Once he moves here, this is where I think things get really interesting, is that to say that the religious believer's faculties are not functioning correctly requires believing already that its outputs are false. Right? So the argument that a religious believer's faculties are not functioning correctly, understanding reliability to be a faculty that produces an overabundance of true beliefs. You have to argue the opposite. If it's unreliable, it means that those beliefs are false.
You're right.
So again, the de jure question, what counts as a justified belief, or a believer in this context now, we're on this horn of the dilemma, what counts as a justified believer has to settle the de facto question. Okay. So tying this together, what happens here? Well, it looks like, so when the divine hiddenness argument says that there's not enough justification, or not enough evidence, and then we take one step further and say, well, what would count as justification or evidence? On both accounts, what would count as a justified belief or what would count as a justified believer, it looks like we have to assume that God doesn't exist. And well, that's an interesting result, right? So the defense of the key premise, there's non-resistant non-belief, has to already assume that God doesn't exist. But if you already assume that God doesn't exist, that violates non-resistance.
Yes, right.
So
So
it's another way of showing a little bit more detail. The same conclusion is that there's this circular pattern. And once you see the circular pattern, you have an argument or a reason for thinking that non-resistance is not satisfied.
Right.
So that's the idea of marketing.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. It's really provocative. It reminds me of the conversation we had, and this section got taken out of my book because the book was already too long. But this in relation to the principle of sufficient reason too. I think there's something in that neighborhood, right? Is that what would it be? It'd be something like this, right? Take what Bill Rowe says. I mean, and he's said before, even to my buddy Jim, that if you think PSR is true, you should be a theist, right? But then the problem of evil or the problem of hiddenness is something where you are sort of demanding an explanation of something.
Yeah.
In one area where you're not consistent with those demands of explanations. And there's an incongruency, there's an inconsistency. And I don't think it's enough to even say it's just an internal critique, because you still want an internal framework that makes sense of things, right? So I don't even think just saying it's an internal critique escapes this problem of inconsistency or incongruence or an indicator of actual resistance. You see what I'm saying?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's right. I remember us talking about that, right? That the principle of sufficient reason is exploited in the very structure of the argument from divine hiddenness, right? Because it's already presumed, or it's in the background, because one is saying that the only way to explain the distribution of religious experience or the lack of persuasiveness of certain arguments is that God doesn't exist. So that's the presumption in inferring 1 and 2 to God doesn't exist. You have to presume some sort of explanatory, the principle of sufficient reason. But once you assume that, well, it shows up elsewhere. It shows up elsewhere and delivers a different judgment.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Bill Rowe, you're right. He does take issue with the principle of sufficient reason. It's interesting. He takes issue, if I remember correctly, with the principle of sufficient reason as applied to the universe as a whole.
That, and he also picks up on, people credit Rowe with this, the objection, but it's really James Ross's objection originally.
Okay.
But it's not immediately relevant, I think, to this debate, which is interesting because James Ross is in fact, here's the book right here. If anyone's interested in, I think, the best attack on the PSR, it's from James Ross. It's actually his philosophical theology book, but he still thinks you can run arguments for God without it. But I would just say that he's got far too expansive a notion of what we're thinking about with PSR for that. But that's that's a different debate. But real quick, before we get to that, the idea of the internal critique is, and this I think is the best sort of response, is say, well, no, it's just you, the theist, who's demanding an explanation for everything. But again, you're rejecting a framework because you think it doesn't make sense and things need to have explanations, right? So there's this wider scope.
Right. Yeah. Very good.
Right.
That's
where
cool.
it's still at play, right? It's still at play enough, I think, that it's indicating that there's something else going on here in this sort of inconsistency. So fair enough, right? The theist is saying, not all theists say no brute facts, but I think theists should say no brute facts, right? But there's a clear indication that atheists are demanding explanations in one area and not demanding them in others.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And that to me is the wider issue. And I don't think just saying it's an internal critique gets away from that problem, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking Russell makes that explicit. He grants in his debate with Colston, I believe this is correct, that the principle of sufficient reason is okay within the universe, but not to the universe as a whole.
The universe is just there. That's all.
And, which I thought was just so convenient.
It is, yeah.
Too convenient, but
yeah,
whatever. But yeah, so those are kind of the ideas that I'm playing around with, relying on Plantinga's terminology of de jure and de facto, and focusing on, well, this second premise of the divine hiddenness argument is really kind of clustering around this idea of what counts as a justified belief or a believer. But if Plantinga's project is correct, that any definition of justification, either for the belief or the believer, is either self-referentially incoherent, or it has to assume an answer to the de facto question.
Yeah.
And his ultimate conclusion, Plantinga's ultimate conclusion, is that there's no argument that theistic belief is unjustified, without also assuming the answer to but there's no independent argument that theistic belief is unjustified. And I think if Plantinga's right on that, then the second premise of the divine hiddenness argument cannot be defended.
Yeah, well, I think that's brilliant. I think that's right, and I want to emphasize that is a better way of attacking that second premise than the PSR one is interesting to me, but that one seems really tight. And that's really cool. By the way, I wanted to hold this up. I conveniently have all the books I need right here for whatever reason. Here's Plantinga. This is the Plantinga book that you're drawing, the primary one, anyways.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Christian belief. It was just sitting right here. Providence. See it? Not hidden. At all.
Right next to the Bible.
Right next to the Bible. Right there. Yeah, it's an amazing book. I don't agree with Plantinga on every question in philosophical theology, but when it comes to epistemology, I'm a big fan. I think it's what you're drawing from Plantinga here to connect to this issue is hugely relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's pretty trustworthy on those issues, and I do assign that to my philosophy of religion students. And
do you assign this thick one, or do you give the he's got the slimmer one too, the knowledge and Christian belief, the kind of?
Oh no, I do assign that one. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, make them work. Make them work. You want to make sure they're getting their money's worth at Villanova, right? Yeah.
Their money's worth, right? So, and I tell the students, when I go on these blogs, these philosophy of religion blogs, and if you look it up, what's the most influential philosophy of religion book in the past 20, 30 years, Warranted Christian Belief shows up in the #1 spot by almost everyone, anyone who comments on this. So yeah, it's a trustworthy starting point. I mean, you're right, philosophical theology, there's some differences there, but when he's getting into religious epistemology, I think he's a trustworthy guide for sure.
Yeah, top tier to be sure. This has been amazing, Stephen. Are there any final thoughts or anything that we forgot to hit on this topic at all?
No, this is great. Thanks for having me on again, and congratulations on all your work.
Thank you.
Have you interviewed yourself?
No, but I've been doing. I'm excited. So people are probably, because this will be the first podcast I've had up in a while. People are probably like, "What's going on?" But with my book, I had about 4 months of extensive promote. I mean, Sophia having me doing podcasts, radio interviews, sometimes like 2 to 3 a day.
Oh, wow.
So I'm just exhausted. I am just absolutely exhausted, and all the art they have you do all the art. So it's great. I'm glad they did it, because it really helped to probably help the book sell all 15 copies at the end of the day. But man, it turned my beard a bit gray. So I've just kind of like taking it easier for a little bit and just try to get some of the the energy back. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, congratulations on that. Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much. So before we say goodbye, how can people keep up with you? And I know you told me behind backstage some things you're working on, but I want to make sure you tease it for people who are who want to keep up with your work.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So I think the best way to keep up with my work is go to my website, which you access by going to Villanova Philosophy Department and click on my name. And I think there's a link to my website, and it's my academia.edu website. So it's not fancy, but it does upload automatically a lot of what I've published and worked on. And plus I put up there some unpublished work, comments here and there. Sometimes I'm going to put up some of my PowerPoint lectures that I give in, or versions, sort of improve, different permutations of what I use in class, not the same thing. That's kind of the repository for most of what I do. The easiest way to access it is through my website at Villanova.
Great. I'll be sure to link that and the paper under discussion in the comment section. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Please leave your thoughts below. And Dr. Napier, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks a lot.